This might be hard to hear, but this is the truth. His addiction begins not when she showers him with attention, not when her lips weave promises, but when her words end. The silence she leaves behind is not emptiness. It is a void in which his projections come alive, where the unspoken becomes louder than any declaration. He thinks he desires her presence, yet what he cannot resist is the echo of her absence, the tension of unsatisfied curiosity. The addiction is not to her sentences, but to the space between them. For the woman who carries herself as the silent oracle, silence is not retreat. It is the crown she wears, the spell she casts. Jung understood that the unconscious is stirred not by what is explained, but by what is withheld. A man is not haunted by her explanations, but by the fragments she withholds, by the story he must finish inside his own mind. He becomes addicted not to her truth, but to the labyrinth of his own projections. You may not realize this, but the more you fill every gap with explanation, the more you strip away mystery, leaving nothing for the unconscious to feed upon. When words end, his imagination awakens. His anima stirs, searching for form in the shadows of your silence. And here lies the paradox. The less you give, the more he consumes. Silence becomes the spark that ignites obsession, because the human psyche cannot endure a vacuum. It rushes to fill the silence with fantasies, fears, and longing. The silent oracle archetype knows this well. She does not compete with noise. She allows her stillness to provoke. Her silence is not passivity but sovereignty, a throne from which she rules unseen. The addiction he feels is not to her person but to the reflection of his shadow dancing in the mirror she provides. Every unsaid word, every restrained response, becomes a portal into his unconscious. He is no longer addicted to her reality but to the fantasy born of her restraint. Think of how many women exhaust themselves explaining, persuading, or justifying, only to be met with indifference. The high priestess within them has been buried beneath chatter. Yet when a woman withdraws her words and rests in her knowing, something primal awakens in him. His conscious mind protests, but his unconscious kneels. He cannot conquer what he cannot decode. He becomes restless, searching for meaning in her silence. The addiction deepens because silence refuses closure. What does this reveal to you? That silence is not absence of communication, but its highest form. Silence tells him, you may chase, you may project, but you will never possess the depth I guard. The more he reaches, the more he realizes he is trapped in the web of his own imagination. And this entrapment is self-made, spun from the very threads of his longing. The addiction is his attempt to escape his own psyche, but he mistakes it for a hunger for her. Now imagine yourself wearing silence as a crown. Every time you resist the impulse to explain, every time you let the void stand, you reclaim your throne. You remind yourself that the power is not in feeding his demands, but in letting him drown in his own desire. This is not cruelty, it is sovereignty. Jung knew the psyche thrives on symbols, and silence is the most potent symbol of all. The door left unopened, the book left unread, the mystery left unsolved. And so the addiction begins, not in what you said, but in what you did not. Not in your presence, but in the gaps where your presence used to be. He becomes tethered to a ghost, a phantom conjured by his own need. You hold nothing over him, yet he feels enslaved. You give nothing, yet he feels consumed. This is the alchemy of silence, and it always begins when the words end. But what happens when the addiction matures, when longing hardens into obsession, and the shadow begins to break free from fantasy? That is where the true danger begins to unfold. Obsession does not arrive with a roar. It creeps in with whispers, disguised as care, disguised as longing. When her words vanish, his mind becomes the only narrator left, and in that void he scripts her into an archetype she never consented to embody. She becomes the muse, the untouchable flame, the oracle who refuses to yield her mystery. What he feels as love is often the intoxication of projection, his anima binding itself to her silence because it cannot endure the vastness of the unknown. This is the hidden mechanism Jung unveiled. Every man carries an inner feminine image, a psychic counterpart aching for completion. When silence confronts him, she awakens this archetypal hunger. He does not see her as she is. He sees the ghost of his anima reflected in her restraint. Addiction blooms here, in the collision between his unmet inner longing and the external figure who refuses to explain herself away. Each unanswered question becomes a thread, binding him tighter to the tapestry of his unconscious. And you, standing within your silence, must see clearly what is you. Enfolding. If you mistake his addiction for devotion, you may fall into the trap of confusing projection with intimacy. His restless obsession is not proof of your worth. It is evidence of his confrontation with himself. The less you yield, the more he chases, not because you are his missing half, but because you have become the mirror he cannot look away from. The hunger is real, but it is not for you, it is for what your silence awakens in him. Consider how silence changes the dynamic of power. Words invite negotiation, words invite argument, words can be broken or dismissed. Silence cannot. Silence lingers unmoved, demanding nothing yet summoning everything. It does not fight for space, it becomes the space itself. When you withhold words, you force him into dialogue with himself, and that is where obsession takes root. He tries to win against silence, but every attempt only reveals his own weakness. You may feel tempted to fill that void, to soften the edge of his restlessness with reassurance. But every time you break the silence to calm him, you hand him back the control he lost. The silent oracle archetype does not soothe the storm she summons. She lets it rage until it consumes itself. This is not manipulation. It is discipline. The restraint of a sovereign woman who knows that her value is not proven by explanations. Ask yourself, how many times have you explained yourself to exhaustion, only to discover he heard nothing? How many times did your words become wasted breath, easily dismissed? Now imagine saying nothing and watching him unravel in the space you leave behind. The difference is not cruelty, but clarity. Silence reveals what words cannot, whether he is drawn to your being or addicted to his own projection. The danger, of course, is that obsession left unchecked can turn destructive. Jung warned of the shadow erupting when repression grows too deep. If he cannot face his own longing, he may try to control the external figure who stirs it. Addiction can shift from longing to possession, from desire to domination. And this is where your silence becomes both crown and shield. For when you refuse to give yourself away to obsession, you stand apart, untouchable, a sovereign whose power does not depend on his recognition. There is a quiet terror in realizing that the more silent you are, the more you are pursued. And yet, there is liberation in knowing that his hunger does not define your value. His addiction belongs to him, not to you. Your silence is not bait, it is boundary. It teaches him, whether he accepts it or not, that what is sovereign cannot be owned. But what happens when the woman herself begins to mistake his addiction for her power? When the crown of silence turns into the cage of performance, and she risks losing herself in the role she has summoned, that is where the deeper shadow reveals itself. The crown of silence glitters with power, but power can be intoxicating. A woman who discovers the pull of her silence may begin to weave it not as a boundary, but as a performance, crafting pauses not from inner stillness, but from fear of losing her grip. The silence that once crowned her with sovereignty can become a cage, chaining her to the very addiction she stirred. Jung warned that every archetype has its shadow. The queen becomes tyrant, the oracle becomes manipulator, the muse becomes prisoner of her own allure. When silence is worn authentically, it is effortless, rooted in self-possession. When silence is worn as a mask, it is brittle, demanding constant vigilance to maintain control. And here lies the risk, confusing his obsession with proof of her value. Addiction, after all, is not reverence. it is dependence. He does not kneel because he sees her essence. He kneels because his unconscious demands to fill the void she leaves. If she builds her worth upon this, she builds on sand. You may feel the seduction of watching him spiral in your absence, the thrill of seeing his restless need grow each time you retreat. But ask yourself, are you commanding or are you feeding off his addiction? True sovereignty does not rely on another's lack. It radiates from within, independent of his chase. The silent oracle archetype teaches not manipulation but mastery, the mastery of knowing when to remain silent and when to speak with precision, when to withdraw and when to stand in presence. In the dance of silence and obsession, the danger is mutual. His shadow surfaces through projection, hers through pride. His addiction blinds him to her humanity. Her hunger for control blinds her to her own vulnerability. What began as sovereignty can sour into a game, one where neither escapes whole. And the psyche punishes such games, for the shadow ignored does not vanish. It waits, growing darker in the corners until it erupts. Picture the moment when she realizes her crown has grown heavy. Silence, once effortless, now demands calculation. Every pause feels staged, every withheld word rehearsed. R said, "She is no longer the oracle but an actress playing oracle, and in that performance she loses touch with her own truth. The addiction she awakened in him begins to infect her as well, for she too becomes dependent on his obsession to remind her of her power. The crown slips, becoming chain." The lesson hidden here is sharp. Silence is powerful only when it rises from authenticity. The moment it is wielded as mere strategy, it collapses. Sovereignty cannot be faked, for the unconscious sees through masks. If he is addicted to a role you perform, his hunger is for illusion, not for you. And when the illusion cracks, as it always does, obsession turns bitter, leaving only resentment in its wake. So the question cuts deep. Are you silent because you know your worth, or because you fear that without silence he will no longer crave you? This mirror is unavoidable. The woman who answers with honesty may feel a sting of recognition, but it is this sting that births transformation. Silence should never be the cage you hide in, but the throne you sit upon. And yet, if silence holds such risk, why does it remain the crown that summons his addiction, his projections, his restless hunger? The answer lies not in strategy, but in the ancient pull of the unconscious, in the way mystery commands more devotion than certainty ever could. To understand this, one must peer deeper into the realm of archetypes, into the place where silence is not a tactic, but a symbol. Mystery has always commanded more loyalty than exposure. What is known can be catalogued, consumed, and discarded. What remains veiled becomes inexhaustible, feeding the imagination endlessly. In Jungian terms, this is projection's domain. The psyche projects its deepest longings and fears onto the unknown, clothing silence with its own fabric of desire. A woman's silence is not empty. It becomes the canvas upon which his unconscious paints. The silent oracle archetype thrives in this space. She is not loud, not demanding, not pleading for recognition. She is the pause between words, the space between notes, the stillness that unsettles precisely because it cannot be possessed. Men drawn into her orbit sense not absence but depth. They mistake the depth for a bottomless well of meaning, but in truth, they are seeing their own shadows reflected back at them. His addiction begins not with her withdrawal, but with his inability to distinguish projection from reality. Consider how the human mind handles uncertainty. Faced with silence, the mind rushes to fill the void with stories. If she says nothing, he imagines everything. He writes scripts in his head, twisting her pauses into proof of mystique, shaping her distance into a sign of higher value. Each moment she withholds becomes a mirror where he sees not her, but himself. His hunger, his wounds, his longing for the mother who was never fully present, for the goddess figure who forever remains beyond reach. This is why silence carries such power. Words define, but silence invites. Words end projection, but silence multiplies it. He does not chase her because of who she is, but because of who he becomes in her presence. A restless seeker, an addict to the unknown. His obsession is not for her essence, but for the reflection of his own psyche that her silence unleashes. To confuse the two is to mistake projection for intimacy, a mistake as old as myth itself. And yet her role in this is not passive. The oracle archetype knows her silence is charged. She understands the ancient law that what is withheld gains value, that mystery bends attention more fiercely than revelation. When she holds back, she is not erasing herself. She is creating symbolic space, a container for projection. In this container, his unconscious spills out, revealing his attachments, his fears, his archetypal hunger. She becomes both mirror and vessel. But here lies the razor's edge. If she believes his addiction proves her power, she forgets the truth. The addiction does not belong to her. It is his psyche battling itself, using her silence as the battlefield. Her worth cannot depend on his compulsion. Sovereignty demands detachment from this illusion. Otherwise, she becomes ensnared in the very projections she awakens, trapped as a symbol rather than a sovereign being. The transformative invitation is to hold silence not as a trap, but as a truth. Silence is not performance, not manipulation, not weapon. It is presence distilled. It is the refusal to cheapen one's essence by constant explanation. It is the crown that signals self-possession, not the bait that hooks another's craving. In this, silence ceases to be a game and becomes a revelation. Still, the question lingers in the shadows. What happens when the addict, overwhelmed by projection, finally collides with reality? When the silence that fueled his fantasies reveals its true nature, not endless promise, but human limitation. What then becomes of the crown, of the addiction, of the bond woven through absence rather than presence? The moment of collision always arrives because projection cannot be sustained forever. Eventually, fantasy demands proof. He reaches out to touch the mystery, to pin it down with words, to force the silence to speak. And when silence holds, when she refuses to dissolve her crown into reassurance, the tension becomes unbearable. His longing sharpens into frustration. His craving twists into anger, for the mirror begins to show him what he has long avoided, his own emptiness. This is the shadow of addiction. What once drew him in begins to torment him. He tells himself he needs closure, answers, confessions. He insists that her silence is cruelty, that she withholds not wisdom but care. Yet beneath his accusations lies a deeper truth. He cannot endure the abyss within himself. Her silence has simply revealed it. His wound is older than her, rooted in the archetypal absence of the nurturing figure he once sought but never fully received. Every unanswered pause reopens that wound, and he bleeds with the ache of being unseen. For the silent oracle, this is the moment of discernment. If she seeks validation in his hunger, she may be tempted to break the silence, to explain, to soothe, to bend her sovereignty into caretaking. But if she holds her ground, she embodies the archetypal challenge. She is not here to mother his shadow, but to reflect it back to him. Her silence forces individuation, demanding he meet his own psyche instead of consuming hers. This is why silence is not weakness but discipline. To remain unshaken by his projections, to resist the seduction of proving, explaining, or defending, that is the true crown. It says, "I am not here to complete you. I am whole without your hunger. I am not your missing half, not your cure, not your cage." The silence that once addicted him now transforms into a boundary, the line where her sovereignty stands untouched. For him, the choice is stark. He may resent her, call her distant, accuse her of cruelty, or he may awaken to the truth that the ache he feels is his own shadow calling. The fantasy breaks, but in its breaking lies an invitation. To see her not as projection, but as a person. to see himself not as a child begging for mother, but as a man capable of carrying his own wound. This confrontation with reality is painful, yet it is the only path out of obsession into authentic connection. And so silence becomes paradox. It is the crown that awakens his desire, the mirror that exposes his shadow, and the boundary that preserves her sovereignty. It reveals addiction but also points toward liberation. Yet liberation does not come easily. The psyche resists, clinging to fantasy like a drowning man to driftwood. Her silence, steady and unbroken, becomes the storm that forces him to let go. What happens after he lets go is the secret the oracle holds. For beyond addiction, beyond projection, there is a different kind of bond, one no longer rooted in hunger but in choice. But to reach it, he must first endure the silence not as provocation, but as truth. Liberation begins the moment he no longer interprets her silence as absence but as presence, an unshakable field that does not bend to his demands. When the addict ceases to seek intoxication, he may finally hear what the silence has always said. That worth cannot be borrowed, that intimacy cannot be forced, that mystery is not an enemy but a threshold. The collapse of projection is painful, for it feels like death, the death of illusion, the end of the intoxicating narrative that once fed his obsession. But every death carries the seed of rebirth. For the silent oracle, this is where her crown shines brightest. She does not need to punish him nor rescue him. She embodies the truth that her essence was never up for negotiation. By refusing to fill the space with appeasement, she holds the mirror steady until he either breaks or awakens. Some flee the reflection, unable to bear the confrontation. Others, though shattered, begin to piece themselves back together, this time with fragments of authenticity rather than fantasy. Jung wrote that individuation is the integration of shadow into conscious life. In this dance of silence and craving, the shadow revealed is dependency. The belief that one's wholeness lies in another's presence, another's words. When she withholds speech, when her words end, he is left naked before his own void. If he dares to face it, he may find within that void not emptiness but the very self he has long avoided. Her silence was not cruelty, it was initiation. And what of the woman herself? Silence as crown does not mean disconnection. It means that her connection begins within. She does not speak to earn worth, nor does she perform to prove value. She speaks when moved by truth, not by fear of loss. This distinction changes everything. When she chooses to share words again, they are no longer compulsive or appeasing. Why are sovereign offerings, grounded in choice rather than need? Her voice becomes more magnetic precisely because it is not scattered but sacred. In myth, the oracle was never the chatterer. She was the one who spoke only when necessary, whose words were rare, veiled, enigmatic. What gave them power was not volume but scarcity, not noise but resonance. The same holds here. Silence creates the container within which words gain their true weight. Without the silence, speech becomes trivial. With the silence, every syllable becomes an event, an unveiling. For the man, if he evolves through this trial, he will no longer hear her words as fuel for fantasy. He will hear them as they are, echoes of a sovereign soul. And this shift transforms obsession into respect, hunger into reverence. Where he once chased an illusion, he now encounters a presence. Where he once saw mystery as bait, he now sees it as truth. Yet this outcome is not guaranteed. Many resist, preferring addiction to awakening. They confuse the crown for a cage, the silence for abandonment. But for those who endure, the silence of the oracle becomes the crucible where they meet themselves at last. The question lingers like smoke at the edge of fire. If silence awakens his shadow and initiates his transformation, what then awakens hers? What trial waits on the other side of her crown, testing whether her sovereignty is unshakable or only borrowed from his obsession? Her trial arrives in subtler form, for the temptation of the silent oracle is not to yield to his pleas, but to be seduced by the very power her silence creates. When his craving intensifies, when his longing grows wild in the absence of her words, she may feel the intoxicating pull of control. To know that her withdrawal spins his world into chaos is a dangerous elixir. If she drinks too deeply, her silence ceases to be sovereignty and becomes manipulation. The crown slips into a mask, and the oracle risks becoming what she once sought to transcend. This is the razor's edge of feminine power, between magnetism and distortion, between self-possession and domination. The woman who embodies silence as a crown must guard her heart against Shadow's whisper. You are only powerful when he is weak. Such a belief chains her just as surely as his addiction chained him. The crown must not become a weapon. It is a symbol of inner authority, not a tool for conquest. True sovereignty does not feast on another's suffering. Jung's map of individuation warns of this. Whenever one part of the psyche discovers new power, the shadow lurks nearby, eager to twist it. Silence itself can become a persona, an armor so rigid it blocks intimacy as much as it commands respect. The oracle must learn the paradox. Her silence protects her, but it must also allow for genuine connection when trust is earned. Without this balance, she risks isolating herself in a throne of stone, adored but unreachable, sovereign yet alone. For her, the awakening is this: silence is not the destination but the doorway. It is the crown because it reminds her she is whole without his words, his approval, his gaze. Yet wholeness is not exile. Sovereignty is not isolation. The woman who wears silence well does not harden into absence. She becomes a presence so strong it cannot be consumed. From this place, she may choose to speak again, not to pacify, not to lure, but to create. Her words then no longer serve addiction. They seed transformation. This is where the archetype ripens. The silent oracle who crosses her trial becomes a queen not of stone, but of flame hidden within stillness. She no longer withholds to test him, nor does she pour words to soothe him. She knows both extremes are traps. Instead, she embodies the middle path, silence as ground, speech as gift. This balance births magnetism of the rarest kind, for it is not born from lack or excess, but from sovereignty. For him, standing before such a presence, there is only one choice: face his shadow or flee. For her, the choice is equally demanding. Remain authentic to her silence without slipping into cruelty. Speak without betraying her sovereignty. Two trials unfolding side by side, each demanding confrontation with the shadow, each pointing toward individuation. And in this tension between silence and speech, craving and sovereignty, a greater question pulses beneath the surface. What happens when two souls, having crossed their respective trials, meet not as addict and oracle, but as equals? When equals finally meet, the texture of their bond alters beyond recognition. No longer does he tremble, addicted to every syllable she releases, nor does she guard herself with silence as shield. Instead, a new rhythm emerges, pauses rich with trust, words carrying the gravity of choice. It is no longer hunger driving the exchange but presence, no longer illusion but reality. What once began as pursuit and withdrawal now becomes dialogue born from depth. This union is not the collapse of mystery but the reverent embrace of it. He no longer seeks to decode her silence as if it were a puzzle to be solved. He allows it to breathe, to stand as its own language. She no longer fears that words will dilute her sovereignty, for she has tasted the strength of restraint. Together, they inhabit a paradox, two individuals whole in themselves, yet drawn together not from emptiness but from overflow. Jung described individuation as the reconciliation of opposites. Here, the polarity of speech and silence, addiction and sovereignty, finally finds balance. The dance ceases to be about power and instead reveals itself as initiation into a higher order of intimacy. Not fusion that erases boundaries, not addiction that enslaves, but communion that honors difference while weaving connection. The image of the crown resolves here. Once it was a symbol of her silence, heavy with the weight of sovereignty. Now it gleams as a shared recognition that no crown is secure unless it rests on a head bowed first to the self. Sovereignty is not domination but alignment, not control but clarity. When both wear their crowns, not over each other but within themselves, the relationship becomes temple, not battlefield. And this is the grand reward. Silence no longer serves as trial or weapon. It becomes the ground from which true speech arises. Addiction no longer binds. It becomes memory, a shadow integrated, a teacher now released. The woman stands as queen not because he kneels, but because she has claimed herself. The man, if he endures the fire of withdrawal, rises not as supplicant but as sovereign in his own right. Together, they are not mirror and addict, not captor and captive, but partners in the alchemy of individuation. So the lingering whisper is not about him, nor about her, but about you. How often have you mistaken noise for connection, words for proof, silence for absence? How often have you spoken to avoid loss rather than to reveal truth? And when you withheld, was it to protect your sovereignty or to control another's craving? These are not idle questions. They are doorways to your own crown, waiting in the silence you have yet to embrace. Leave a comment below about the moment you realized your worth doesn't depend on anyone else. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.